So, two things. One is ask questions throughout, okay? We're not going to save them up because we do have a hard stop at 3 for other reasons. So we never get to the end of the slides we prepare. We've done this a lot of times. And so there won't be a Q&A at the end. So anything you want to ask about, Georgetown history, ask away. Lynn is an astonishingly knowledgeable person about our shared space, and you don't have to ask about the stuff we're showing you. We're going to show you things out of order, and we decided to begin with this one, which is from the 1920s, because I wanted to emphasize at the start of our talk the way Georgetown has been changing. This is an unbuilt plan, right? Everybody here realizes that whatever this design looks like, you never saw it. So what you need to think about is that Georgetown is kind of constantly rethinking itself. It's rethinking its space, but it's also rethinking its mission in relation to its space. And it's constantly constricted by the limit of the footprint, right? We just don't have a lot of land. And it's awkward land, especially in the 19th century. So what you get is a kind of really interesting dialogue, in effect, between what Georgetown's trying to do at any one moment and what it can do at any one moment, and finally what it does do at that moment. And the reason I thought it would be interesting to start is, I think sometimes I've been here all my life, but I think when one only knows Georgetown for a certain 4-year period, there's a tendency to think that's always been Georgetown. That's sort of the authentic Georgetown, and any changes after that are somehow a kind of divagation from what it's supposed to be or what it really is. In fact, one intersects a place that's always changing. So the Georgetown you knew is quite different from all the Georgetowns that were before the Georgetown you knew, and because it's an organic and healthy and growing and functioning place, all the Georgetowns after the Georgetown you knew are different also. And so if we just sort of start thinking about a whole series of moments of intersection, I think we get to think a little bit more effectively about the curious nature of what it is we're describing. And I think, Lynn, that ought to get you to talk about this curious thing behind this.
Sure, absolutely. So this document was produced in 1922. Out of here. Okay.
And maybe the technician could collect these two and get them to work.
Okay, so starting again, this document was produced in 1922. After World War I, the enrollment on campus basically doubled. So there was a need for much more space on campus. As you can see, you've got the quadrangle, which we know today, but the expansion was going to be to the north and the east of that. This was part of a capital campaign that was called Greater Georgetown. It was going to raise $5 million to build these buildings. It ran in the early 20s and wasn't really successful. The only building that came out of Greater Georgetown the first time it was run was actually New York, which doesn't appear on this. But then Coleman Nevels became president of Georgetown in 1928, and he was a man who very definitely had a vision. And he revived Greater Georgetown and expanded on it. And he started to build the buildings that you see. You can see that they're labeled Science Building, New Dormitory, and Museum Building. When he started, the Science Building and the Dormitory Building actually swapped. So he started with Copley, which opened in 1931. He was able to build that significantly under budget. Then he moved to White Gravener, and the budget for that was going to be $1 million. And that amount of money made his superiors in the Maryland province and in Rome a little nervous, given the time period. We're talking about the Depression. So he was told he had to raise at least half of the money before he could start. And Coleman Nevels was definitely a very persuasive individual, and he was very able to use whatever he had available to him. So the way he raised money was to say that he was actually helping the economy. He was employing people. So if people gave Georgetown money, they were able to employ people to build buildings. And he actually wrote a letter to Hoover saying that White Grosvenor was going to occupy 395 men for about 9 months. But then, when they moved on to the third building, which was going to be, by the time Neville's finished with his plans, a classroom building, there just wasn't money to do it. So that third building, which was going to be called Poulton Hall, was actually obviously never built. And then there's the very interesting stadium, which you see at the top of the plan. The athletic field was originally what's Copley Lawn today. So once you started building Copley and White Grosvenor, you obviously had to move the athletic field. So the plan was to build a 20,000-seat stadium. And the reason we were building a stadium, or thinking of building a stadium that size, was we were very much a football school at this point. Football at Georgetown dates back to 1889. We played our first game against UVA and won 34-0. Georgetown had some really good teams. In the 1920s, we were certainly nationally ranked. In 1941, Georgetown went to the Orange Bowl. We didn't win, so we won't talk about that. But the football program basically lost money. And one of the reasons it lost money was we never built a stadium on campus. And we used the stadium, Griffith Stadium, which was at Georgia and W, I think, which was the home of the Washington Senators baseball team. So we had to pay for that. So we basically didn't make money. And in 1951, a new president came in and just axed the football program totally. So that's kind of the background to this document. Paul, do you have anything?
Well, we're going to get this mic situation fixed, so hand that back to
Okay.
John. This one, which should be working. I'll just talk loudly.
Okay.
That's okay. So John, if you could jump in, one of other Coleman Neville's hallmarks was dating the start, the founding of Georgetown back 150 years.
Right. So,
And it's reflected in the architecture of White Grosvenor.
Before we talk about that, I want to make sure people notice that the stadium has, I think, a really curious structure. And Coleman Neville's was very enterprising, and my hunch is that he planned to do horse racing if it didn't work as a university. I think that's sort of the only way you can imagine why he wanted to build a stadium that looked like that. The other thing I want to call your attention to is if you look at the wiggly line that goes up from the back of the quadrangle toward the stadium, you'll see a very small oblong, and that's the swimming pool. There was a swimming pool. And the curious thing about it is it backed onto the Jesuit graveyard, which I would imagine made swimming excursions peculiar, or maybe people were just safer than they would have been because they could see what would happen if they took risks. The dating of Georgetown, and we'll soon go back to John Carroll, the dating of Georgetown is always very problematic, right? Because we've decided that we started in 1789. There was nothing here in 1789. There wasn't really even a purchase in 1789. There was a promise of a purchase in 1789. But of course, the really interesting thing about 1789 was that the country began in 1789, or at least the nation as we know it, the constitutionally defined nation, began in 1789. And so we have sort of appropriated that date. And one of the things that I think you'll see is that kind of over and over again in our history, there's a kind of mixture of fact and myth. And the myths, I think, are in every case more interesting than the facts, because you really do get a sense always of what Georgetown was aspiring to be. When John Carroll founded Georgetown, he really wasn't thinking about what we would think of as a university. And I think it's important to get a sense that the notion that people had to go to college, let alone go to universities, is really a late 19th century idea, even an early 20th century idea. What you really ought to think about in terms of the founding of Georgetown is something like a Catholic Eton or Harrow, a boarding school that you would stay in until you were 19 or 20, and then you'd launch yourself into the world in a wide variety of different ways. And that remains, as many of you probably know, very much still a kind of British practice. It's interesting that Prince Harry didn't go to university. Only the Prince of Wales of the Queen's children went to university. It's still possible in England, if you go to the right school in the middle, to then go on and join the officer corps or begin to train in London in various professions. So what did John Carroll start? John Carroll started a boarding school, like the boarding school that he knew in the Low Countries when he was sent away by his family to start his education in the 18th century. And again, one of the big changes, of course, at Georgetown has been this steady growth in our ambition for what we are, and a steady realization that all the potential that we have is still unrealized in a lot of different ways. But we can go back to, want to go back to Carol's proposal?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So to build on what John just said, you'll see that this is basically the founding document. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is basically the founding document for Georgetown. These are John Carroll's proposals for establishing an academy, and that gets to what John was just saying about the type of school that was being founded at Georgetown, Potomac River, Maryland. And I once had a university administrator ask me where Georgetown had moved from, because, you know, he was looking at this document and he said, oh, Georgetown was originally in Maryland, and I had to explain to him that Georgetown didn't move Maryland. DC wasn't incorporated until 1802, and this document dates from late, probably 1786 or early 1787. So John Carroll published this. He published it in the U.S. and he published it in Europe as well. And he was basically using this document to try and raise money for Georgetown, with ultimately very little success. But you can see that the first line actually specifies what Carroll's intentions were. The object of the proposed institution is to unite the means of communicating science with an effectual provision for guarding and improving the morals of youth. So Carroll was trying to do two things. He was trying to educate. He was also trying to prepare youth to be good citizens. He wanted youth, particularly Catholic youth, to be able to play a role in shaping the new republic. He also wanted to make sure that there was a pool of educated candidates for the priesthood. But he was also very clear in saying, and you can see in the third paragraph, agreeably to the liberal principle of our Constitution, the seminary, and seminary here is just an old word for school, will be open to students of every religious profession. So Carroll did write into the founding document that Georgetown was not going to be an exclusively Catholic school. And certainly in the first decade of our existence, about 20% of the Georgetown students were not Catholic. One of my favorite parts of this is the fourth paragraph, which talks about why Carroll selected Georgetown as the location for his school. He did consider Philadelphia, he did consider Baltimore, and he certainly wanted an urban setting for his school because that was the Jesuit tradition. But the reasons for picking Georgetown were really very pragmatic. In choice of situation, salubrity of air, because we were on a hilltop, we were considered healthy. Convenience of communication, we were next to what was going to be the federal city and next to the river as well. And cheapness of living, have been principally consulted. And it's really the cheapness of living. I mean, John Carroll wasn't able to raise any money. He had to rely on the income from the Jesuit farms in Maryland. Land in Georgetown was cheap, and that was why we ended up where we are. There's also, you'll notice in the next paragraph, the price of tuition will be moderate. In the course of a few years, it will be reduced still lower. You probably won't be surprised to know that neither one of those statements is actually true. Tuition was £10 a year, board was £30 a year, and that was a lot more than a labourer made, and probably about a quarter of what a skilled artisan made. So we ended up with something of a barter system for our early students. Students would come and they would bring coffee or sugar or tobacco. There are records in the archives of widows working as seamstresses for the college to defer part of their sons' tuition fees. Tuition was never reduced. In fact, the first printed document that Georgetown College produced was a notice saying that fees were going to be raised.
John, I'm wondering, conspicuous in its absence in all of the proposals is the word Catholic. And I would never have imagined that the founding document of the university, the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university, wouldn't include the word Catholic, but there was some reasoning behind that.
I got my green light. A couple of different reasons. One coming from the particular circumstances of families like the Carrolls, and one coming from a larger national characteristic. The national characteristic is that there was still enormous anti-Catholicism in the early Republic. There was a long, long history, right, of a kind of Protestant-Catholic divide in England, going way back to the 16th century, and that didn't suddenly come to an end when America broke free from England. So there continued to be a deep suspicion of all things Catholic. Thomas Jefferson said that we should not admit any of the priests fleeing the French Revolution because they had produced all of the evil that the revolution was caused by, and if they came to this country, they'd reproduce that evil. And John Adams said that every Jesuit in history is burning in hell. So there was a real sense that sort of calling something Catholic was a mistake, at least you had to be careful. But the other reason was that the Catholic planter class, the class from which Carroll came, had been almost ruined by the revolution. They planted tobacco. They exported their tobacco to England. The war went on for a very long time. You borrowed money, you planted a crop, you harvested the crop, you put the crop in a warehouse. You couldn't do anything with the crop because you couldn't ship during the war. You borrowed more money, you planted another crop. That year's crop went into the warehouse. As year followed year, the amount of debt of these families became prodigious, and it took them a very long time to dig themselves back out of that economic hole that the revolution had caused for them. And since that's really the set of Catholic families that are really behind the founding of Georgetown, many of them cousins of Carroll himself, you had to actually appeal to other people. If you had relied on the kind of class from which Carroll came, the class that really needed this kind of school, because there hadn't been anything like that under the English rule, you would never have been able to even get it off the ground. So we are really lucky in the sense that we are by a kind of back formation, or ecumenical, right? I think we didn't start out in some deliberate way to be ecumenical because we thought it was theoretically very good. I think we just had to be ecumenical to survive. And of course it has become, I think, one of our largest boasts. Before we turn it back, Lynn talked about the hillside and the salubrious character. One of the missing parts of Georgetown is the vineyard. So Jesuit places always had vineyards, if they could, to make mass wine. And if you think about where the observatory is, there used to be a wonderful hill that went all the way down to where McDonough is now. Most of it has now been taken up by the heating plant. But when that hill was intact in the 19th century, it was a vineyard. And apparently just a terrific place because of the south-facing hillside and the mists off the river, a terrific place to raise grapes. So one of the things that we have lost is not only the racetrack, we've also lost the vineyard and the possibility of having our own wine. We've been going on for a bit, and I wonder if I'll spot any hands that people have that it's a good moment to see if people have any questions about this early. Yes, sir.
So you had mentioned about the anti-Catholicism and about the Jesuit identity. So during our founding, there's obviously the Jesuit suppression. So I'm curious about how you came to assume this Jesuit identity in light of this suppression.
Terrific question. Yes. Well, all right. This, as many of you know, probably all of you know, the Society of Jesus was suppressed at the end of the 18th century by the Pope. The kings of Europe, the Catholic kings of Europe, had become very angry at the Jesuits for a number of different reasons, in part because the Jesuits were interfering with their colonial enterprises. And this is the sort of the good side of the suppression. That is, they were standing up for indigenous populations in parts of the world that were being ruthlessly colonized. And so they were making themselves annoying to various colonial administrators and therefore to various royal courts. But the other, and this is not so good, the other side of it was that the Jesuits in those days were really papalists. They really represented the Pope's claim to have authority over all the Catholic courts. And so in many ways they undermined, or were thought anyway, to undermine the authority of the monarch. So there was an enormous amount of tension between, within, it's not a kind of Protestant Catholic thing here, but really within a kind of a Catholic establishment over the role of the Jesuits. Finally, the kings were powerful enough, Portugal, Spain, France, to get the Pope to suppress the society. All their property was taken away. The general of the Jesuits was jailed, and the Jesuit priests could no longer be Jesuits. John Carroll, by that point, had become a Jesuit. And so in the first years of the founding of Georgetown, he was, call him an ex-Jesuit, he was Father Carroll, but not Father Carroll S.J. In 1814, 1815, the society, after the Napoleonic Wars, was recreated in a really different form, but nevertheless recreated. All the people who had been Jesuits became Jesuits again. And with very complex problems with property, because when the society was suppressed, all of their property in any diocese was given to what's called the ordinary. That is, their property became the property of the bishop. So, as you know, and we'll get to this later, the Jesuits owned extensive plantations in Maryland. When they were suppressed, those lands became the property of the Diocese of Baltimore, when there was a Diocese of Baltimore. This is much more detailed than I want to get into. But after, for a long time afterwards, there was a kind of legal battle between the Bishop of Baltimore and the Jesuits about who owned that property. And when, this is the ugly story we'll get to, when we sold the slaves, we actually had to we went to court with the diocese about the profits from the sale of the slaves. And we divided those profits with the Bishop of Baltimore, the Archbishop of Baltimore, as a way to sort of simply settle out of court from that legal dispute. So John Carroll was a Jesuit. He was not a Jesuit when he founded Georgetown. He became a Jesuit shortly thereafter, as did all the other men who were his colleagues, in what was called sometimes the Catholic Gentlemen of Georgetown. And we've been Jesuit since 1815, when you could be a Jesuit. So we actually owe it all to Napoleon. Chris.
So I have a question that is prompted by the first few slides, and John, your discussion of labels of this institution. So you've mentioned boarding school, we see academy here. I will think of it maybe later more as a liberal arts college in the New England mold. Now, it is a research university. And the question is also one about separating fact from myth. The myth that I was told was that this became a research university because of the explosion of the basketball team in the mid-80s. That there was more attention paid to the university, maybe more money came in. I'm assuming that is myth. What is the fact around when Georgetown eventually and finally became a research institution?
Do you want to take this? No? All right. I think Chris is my former student, which is why he's making it hard for me. I think it is safe to say that it has been a research institution since shortly after the Second World War. It has become a sort of first-rate research institution for the past 35 to 40 years. The great change at Georgetown, what I don't think people talk about or write about or know about enough, is the way in which the faculty was changed in the 30s and 40s by the hiring of European refugees. So one of the things that happened in the 30s as the fascists took over various German, Austrian universities, and then later in places like Poland, was that very, very distinguished Catholic intellectuals fled, if they could, and found in Georgetown, a Catholic institution, a home. So you suddenly had a kind of upscaling of the faculty, a kind of unearned upscaling of the faculty. And it really is interesting if you go back, you can see how these men, names like Ahlers, really changed their departments. I mean, they just got different people hired, and they set a different standard for publication, and they set a different standard for teaching, and the department followed suit. So by the end of the 40s, we had just a very, very different faculty than we had before, and a very different sense of what this should be. It wasn't just a kind of like a boys' college anymore. It really was something like a European university. And the departments that those people transformed, decade by decade after that, took advantage of the fact that the country was investing in research universities. I mean, one of the things that everybody understands is that the Second World War was really transformative of the academy in this country. The enormous need to invest in research to produce the victories of the war, and then the enormous need to keep investing in research to keep the United States ahead in the Cold War meant that universities were really being paid by the feds to do research, which of course was a completely new phenomenon in this country. And we tagged along with that for a very long time. I went to a conference in the mid-1980s in California, and someone said to me, "Now, John, I don't quite get Georgetown. Is Georgetown entirely funded by the CIA, or is it a branch of the CIA?" So gradually, as we more and more produced this kind of faculty in this kind of place, and began to be able to hire in a really different way people who expected, if they came here, to be rewarded for significant publication. It changed. It had nothing to do with basketball. It did have a lot to do with Timothy Healy. And Timothy Healy, who had an Oxford doctorate and really had an experience before he came here of being in major non-Catholic universities, the City University of New York, of which he was, I think, a vice chancellor. Is that right? Vice chancellor? Vice chancellor. He simply had a vision for what real universities felt like. And when he got here, he didn't feel like it was one. I once went to dinner with Father Healy, and this would have been the early 1980s, and I said, what's your ambition? You know, what would you like to be your legacy at Georgetown? And he said, "I'd like to leave a faculty as good as the student body." And I don't know that he accomplished that by the time he left at the end of the 80s, but he'd be awfully proud of the faculty that's there now.
I think I would add to Father Healy's legacy, because I think it is fair to point to him as a next inflection point. Retrospectively now, and Father Healy never said that he thought of all of this in the moment as a grand strategy, but there were three elements to Father Healy's presidency which ended up being very significant to who we are today, and basketball was a part of it, but it wasn't one of the three anchors. The three anchors were, he wanted to create a residential campus. So when he started as president, the university had fewer than 1,000 beds. Second, he wanted to double the size of the faculty, which he did over the course of the 80s. And he did that by virtue of raising tuition double digits for every year for the better part of a decade. And third, this is really significant, but not always well known. In 1978, Father Healy made a university commitment to meet full need of financial aid of students. So Georgetown was always need blind, namely the admissions office made its decisions without regard for a student's ability to pay. But it never committed to close the gap between the cost of attending Georgetown and the family's ability to pay. Father Healy committed Georgetown to an elite group of fewer than 30 universities who today, and this is still the only group, only 30 universities meet the full demonstrated need of every student. The key to that was that he realized that talent doesn't exist only on the wealthy end of the spectrum. You have to be able to admit students from every economic background in order to have the type of intellectual, societal diversity that actually, to your point, John, reflects the quality of the faculty that Father Healy is building. It's a virtuous circle. Faculty want to be with the best students, the students want to be with the best faculty. You have to have a residential campus in which they all can live and teach. And that, I would say, is equal part his legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he really is the third founder. There's no doubt about the fact that he's the third founder. I see a hand way up there. Shout.
Yeah, the university started as not necessarily totally Catholic, but at least when I was here many years ago, it has almost exclusively Catholic. At least the College of Arts and Sciences was, I would say, 95% Catholic. How did that evolution take place, and why did it take place? Why did it move from a more secular, less Catholic to at least when I was there, a totally Catholic university? I know now that's changed again, but I'm curious how that happened.
I'll give you my theory, right? This is the John Glavin theory of how that happened. It happened because in the 19th century, Catholics realized that if they were going to function and succeed in this country, they were not going to be able to do it by integrating into the establishment that was already there, but they would only be able to do it by creating a kind of parallel universe. So throughout the 19th century, successful immigrant Catholic families began to use their connections and whatever wealth they had to create a whole series of institutions which in a sense stood next to the non-Catholic institutions that were already there and already much more richly established. And this is across the board, right? So there were Catholic hospitals, and Catholic doctors practiced in Catholic hospitals, and there were Catholic law firms because the white shoe law firms wouldn't partner Catholics. And there were Catholic schools. There was a whole parochial school system and high school system that existed in parallel to the public school system. I myself am a product of such a system in Philadelphia. And there were, of course, Catholic colleges and Catholic universities. The Catholic colleges for women run largely by orders of nuns, and the Catholic colleges and universities, notably those run by the Jesuits. So what happened in the 19th century was a kind of pulling back from the aspiration of an integration of Catholics and non-Catholics in common institutions to a much more strictly defined ghettoizing, self-ghettoizing of Catholics. When I graduated from high school in 1960 in Philadelphia from the Jesuit high school there, the headmaster was forbidden by the cardinal to send our grades on to any but Catholic colleges. So you know, the system was sort of self-perpetuating, and Georgetown's aspiration and all of that was to be the equivalent of the Ivies, right? So that it was the place where very well-to-do Catholics could respectably go to school. In one of John O'Hara's novels, I think it's Appointment in Samara, but I'm wrong, I'm probably wrong about that, someone in the 1930s says, Georgetown is the only college you can go to, Catholic college you can go to and still remain in the social register. And then what ended that was John Kennedy. Right? When John Kennedy became president, it suddenly became clear that we weren't living in a fortress anymore, that that fortress had outlived its usefulness, that in fact that integration of Catholics and non-Catholics had happened, and very, very rapidly the need for this ghetto really evaporated. And then we moved decade by decade into the much more wonderfully heterogeneous and mixed atmosphere that we currently enjoy. So that's John Glavin. You're not going to get that anywhere else, and you can probably take it with a grain of salt. But I think, since I lived part of it, I think that's the truth. Yeah?
Could you tell us the origin story of the School of Foreign Service?
So the School of Foreign Service, as I suspect you probably know, came out of the aftermath of World War I. The idea was that if you could create a school that would train diplomats, but that would also train people who would then have expertise in international business, because the business school actually has its origins in the Foreign Service School. Business school didn't become an independent school until, I'm going to say 1957. There's some debate over when the school actually became a school. But the idea that if people were connected by ties of commerce and business, there would be much less likelihood of having another world war. So that's the short story of how the Foreign Service School came to be.
It's an interesting story, and it's going to be better known in 2 years. As you know, 1919 is the centenary of the founding of the School of Foreign Service, and the current dean of the School of Foreign Service has been commissioning a lot of work on the history of the founding, and there will be publication on the history of the founding. So those of you who are alumni of the School of Foreign Service will be able to really get authenticated historical, scholarly accounts of this. One of the things I found most interesting, and what I've overheard of people talking about this, is that we think of sort of as Father Walsh, this is Father Walsh's idea, and actually, in an interesting way, it's sort of like what the other things we've been talking about. It's actually not his original idea. He was just smart enough to figure out that we should do it. There was a notable kind of international scholar who was trying to shop this idea around to the Ivy University. He was trying to get Yale and Princeton to realize that this is a school they should have, given what was happening in the world. And there were no takers. And it was really Walsh who said, all right, you know, and I think in some part, going back to words we talked about before, in some part because of the Jesuit background. That is, if you live in a global institution, if you grew up and you've been shaped by a global institution, then when somebody comes to you and says, you ought to have a school which really is fundamentally global in its outlook, you immediately understand the value of that, which you might not immediately understand if you were living in an entirely nationalistic and narrowly in-facing culture. So we should credit Father Walsh with this, because he was bright enough to realize that Georgetown was the fertile ground for that school. And it's modeled on the French school, which has disappeared, or at least it's been morphed into the Sciences Po in Paris. But that's the sort of pattern that this guy was teaching.
It's an interesting fun fact is that the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown predates the United States Foreign Service.
When was the first woman admitted to campus, and what was the history behind the scenes decision making on that?
That's not the question you want to ask.
That's a better one.
Well, no, I think the question you want to ask is, when was the first woman admitted to Georgetown? Not campus. Because,
Well, the answer is probably a lot earlier than you think. People ask me this question from time to time, and I end up in some cases saying, it depends what you mean by woman.
Not just campus.
By admitted, and it depends what you mean by campus. So it's a complicated answer, but the basic answer is 1880. So in 1880, 1881, that academic year, there were 2 women who somehow managed to get admitted to the medical school, which was off campus. It was at H Street at that point. Annie Rice of Maine and Jeanette Sumner of Michigan. And there is absolutely nothing in the archives which indicates why they were admitted. They left after a year. There's nothing that indicates why they left, although I have theories that they did not feel particularly welcome. And they actually graduated from a medical college in Philadelphia. Although they did both come back to DC, and they actually started one of the first clinics for poor women and children in DC. After that, there is a gap, and you have the nursing school, which is founded in 1903. Again, the nurses were living off campus, and they were always not really considered on the same level as the other Georgetown students, because they did not get bachelor's degrees. They got diplomas, and the reason why the nursing school started was we had started Georgetown Hospital in 1898, and an order of nuns had come in to staff the hospital, but they realized relatively quickly that they weren't going to be able to supply enough nursing sisters. So Georgetown started So the nurses did not pay tuition, they actually got paid a stipend while they were training, because most of their training took place in a clinical setting. The first women to get degrees from Georgetown actually also never set foot on campus. The practice developed around World War I of Georgetown faculty going to the visitation convent next door to teach classes to the nuns there. And at a certain point, the superior realized that she had nuns who had more than enough credit hours to actually have earned a Georgetown degree. So you start having visitation sisters getting bachelor's, master's, and PhDs starting in the late teens, early 1920s. I could go on, but it's a complicated history. But I know I was surprised when I discovered that 1880 is actually the first year that women were admitted as students.
When I was an undergraduate here between 1960 and 1964, all of the women, except for the nurses, lived in the Meridian Hill Hotel on 16th Street, and were bussed in every morning for class and bussed back for dinner, and they didn't set foot on campus again until the next morning. So you talk about campus, it was a very odd experience. There were women, but they didn't stay.
You have a slide on Miss G goes to Georgetown,
Yes.
which is a lot of fun.
This is really should be seen.
It's the last slide, so bear with me. You're getting a preview. Okay, so starting in 1959 through I think about 1970, there were actually two handbooks. The G book, which was for the male students, and Miss G, which was for the women students. And the content of the handbooks was radically different. Even the cover art kind of strikes me, because the G book has covers that show the male students in debate or in class or sitting in a library reading. The women who are on the cover of Miss G tend to pose somewhat decoratively and not necessarily doing anything. And I love this one because she's actually on the outside kind of looking in, which I think says a lot about the position of women at this point. But the content is also interesting. The G book had information about the grading process, guidelines for student demonstrations, the athletic schedule. Miss G, as you can see if you can read the slide behind me, had information about how to dress for class and for other events, and also useful information like where you could sunbathe on campus. Miss G also had a demerit system in it that isn't something that's in the G book. So 350 demerits in a semester would when you earn you a trip to the Dean of Women's Students. So you would get 20 demerits for careless grooming, or 50 demerits for public displays of affection in the proximity of the dormitory. I don't know how proximate you had to be, but there was nothing like that in the G books.
My name is Robert Colby, I'm class of 49.
Oh, you do know Georgetown.
No, they know me, but how much money will it never mind. When I arrived here on July the 1st, 1946, and we were part of what was known as the July Freshman. I don't know what that rings with anybody. My archivist shakes her head.
So tell me, I'm learning. This is one of the fun things.
In any event, there were, at that time, no female, girl, woman, choose whatever nomenclature, attended any class at the college. By the time 1949 came, they were not enrolled in the college, but they came out of the nursing school and did in fact attend some classes. At that point in time, there were no black students, even at the time I left. And by the time I got to Georgetown Law School, we had our first black, who came out of Louisiana, might add, ended up on the District of Columbia bench, and was later disbarred, but that's another. No causality there, just the way it was.
Did I see a hand? Yes.
I'm one of the nurses.
Congratulations. Thank you.
I graduated in 1957. We were a part of the campus. We were not allowed to take any classes with the boys, but we had the same professors that they did. We took the college, first 2 years were all college classes. And then we started taking nursing classes in the summer of our sophomore year and started working in the hospital. But we were an integrated part of the campus.
Where did you live?
We lived in St. Mary's Hall, which was part of the old hospital.
Right.
And that was the old Foreign Service School. We had the front hall of the hospital, the boys that were sophomores had the other half, and they had a door connecting us. But it was rather interesting. We did the same, we were here, we were separate but equal.
And I want to point out, because there may be some people who are alumni of it, we used to have a school called the Institute of Languages and Linguistics, which was established after the Second World War. And that was heavily female in its enrollment. So there were actually many, many women on campus in the 40s and 50s and 60s, although not integrated into the older schools in the way that later happened in the 70s.
I always have been curious as to the timing of when the hospital left the east, the campus where the School of Foreign Service was, where I attended it, and moved to Reservoir Road, and how that transition occurred, because I know there were nursing students over there when the hospital was over there. When does that take place?
1947 was when the new hospital opened on Reservoir, and I think by that point it had just outgrown the space on the old hospital footprint, which was Prospect and N, I think. It might have gone around the corner as well. So I think it was more just a necessity for more space.
So more about the Institute of Languages and Linguistics. I was in the FLL, and now nobody's ever even heard of the FLL. It just seems like it's been completely absorbed into the college. What's sort of the history of the demise of the Institute of Languages and Linguistics?
I remember the academic justification, so that was 1995 that had happened. At that point, the history department, the government department, and the economics department were all a part of the School of Foreign Service. The School of Language and Linguistics was instituted as a separate school. And one of the academic reasons, I don't know if it was the overriding one, was that the evolution of linguistics had come, that studying languages as a science, which was the approach of linguistics to learning languages, was antiquated. That the better way was to integrate it with cultural studies. So for example, you would be reading Spanish literature rather than the phonics of Spanish. And it was a divisive issue. Not everyone agreed with that. But that was the prevailing logic behind folding the only oldest school of languages and linguistics in the world, for which Georgetown was renowned, into another school and losing its identity as a school.
Just a factor which contributes to that, although Paul is absolutely right in everything he said. The School of Languages was in large part prompted by the Cold War. That is, there's this enormous need people perceived after the war to have people in this country who actually spoke languages other than the major European languages. And so during those periods of the 50s and the 60s where there were all these simultaneous translators, I don't know if people remember a movie with Audrey Hepburn called Charade, in which she's a translator of French to English in Paris, but these were sort of glamorous jobs. You know, you went to college and you became a simultaneous translator, and then you worked in the UN or you worked in something like that. Those jobs began to disappear, and in some ways it was created to produce people to fill a certain kind of role. That role gradually stopped being a necessary one in the larger culture. And so it was just a shrinking job market that in many ways drove the sense that if we're going to teach languages, we really had to teach languages in a different way for a different kind of purpose. And those of us who remember languages at Georgetown, it was just spectacular, the wide range of languages that we used to teach and the wide range of languages in which people majored. And unfortunately, we've never been able to get back to that marvelous range. It's a great loss. There was a, yeah.
I would just like to follow up on the comment about the faculty, so-called faculty of languages and linguistics is now a part of college, if it still exists. I don't know if that's disappeared too. But I would just point out that not everyone agrees with the perspective, not all academics agree with the perspective of integrating a language and culture program into a college of arts and sciences. One of my graduate schools has created a school of languages and linguistics to go in the opposite direction, where they not only have languages and linguistics, but also cultural immersion and literature, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Georgetown made that decision.
Although I want to say, you're absolutely right, of course. As a member of the faculty, it's astonishing to me how brave our undergraduates are in the learning of languages now. People just come and they take up Arabic and Chinese at the start of their freshman year in these hugely demanding 6-credit courses. There's a real sense among the undergraduates that you really do have to go into the world equipped with more than one language. And it is part of the vibrant culture here, even though the academic structures no longer reflect an earlier version of that enthusiasm.
The number of students who study abroad at Georgetown is extraordinary. It's more than 50%. The national average is less than 20%.
Yes?
At the risk of being this language and linguistics course, I was enrolled in CLL, but they took it away from us in my junior year when we became the FLL. And you just mentioned how it was the disagreement about the focus on the science. The degree that I got was a Bachelor of Science in Languages. Is that what is still given? I was a Russian major. Is it now like a Bachelor of Arts in Languages? So they did change.
You'd get a Bachelor of Arts and your major would be Russian.
How long ago did that change?
Oh, the exact year of that I don't know, but I think when in '95 the faculty of the School of Languages was folded into the faculty at the college, then it had to become one of the 2 degrees the college gives legally, the Bachelor of Arts and the Bachelor of Sciences. And I think the languages are on the arts side, not the science side.
Okay. Yeah, to explain what BSLA was, it was on a transfer.
And we're going to be running up on time. At the pace we're going, we could probably do 2 more questions.
I see 3 hands.
Do we still do much about the ratio studiorum in our curriculum?
No, we don't. There you go. That's a fast answer. I think you and I are one of the 7 people in this room who knows what you're referring to. Right. We can talk about that later. There was another hand way at the back, I thought. Yes, way at the back.
Thank you, sir. I defer my question to the gentleman at the end of the row. Sir?
That's my son who gave me his minute here. I just want to get back to Father Walsh for just a minute, and that is when I was here in the 60s, it was considered a truism that Father Walsh had dinner with one Senator Joe McCarthy here on campus, suggested to him that he might look into the communists in the State Department. 10 days later, Senator McCarthy went to Wheeling, West Virginia, reached in his inside pocket and pulled out a list. Any truth to that? That it was Father Walsh who planted that seed?
I'm not aware that
I've
that
seen it
is
in
true,
print twice.
But, so I can neither confirm nor deny it.
I think there's going to be a lot about that in 2019, but it is certainly not true that Father Walsh planted the seed. And as you can imagine, given the time frame of 10 days, it's unlikely that there would have been something as devastating and powerful as what Senator McCarthy did that would have emerged in 10 days after a dinner. But it is not untrue, we think, that Father Walsh and Senator McCarthy had conversations. Father Walsh, as you probably know, was one of the reasons he came to the idea of the Foreign Service School was that he was part of the mission to Russia after the revolution and became fiercely anti-Bolshevik when he saw what had happened to Russia as a result of the revolution. For the rest of his career, he remained deeply suspicious of communist Russia and very sympathetic to those who opposed communism. And in that, of course, he was completely at one with the papacy. which also developed a sense that to be Catholic was to be anti-communist in some very powerful kind of way. So, it's not unlikely. In fact, it is very likely that Father Walsh, in some way, was in conversation with Senator McCarthy, that he was the planter of the seed or the source of the names. That seems much less reliable a narrative. I think Paul, that's it.
I was going to ask Lynn, before we close, would you want to talk about the artifacts that you brought? Not talk about them, but maybe just
right.
introduce.
So we do have a couple of items that we brought from the archives that if you get the chance to come down very quickly and look at them. So we have John Carroll's proposals, his fundraising letter. The item in the middle is a bill of sale from 1802. We never got to talk about slavery, but that bill shows that the president of Georgetown in 1802 bought a man named Mont on behalf of and for use of Georgetown College. So that's just a small piece of the history of Georgetown and slavery. And then the final item is a wonderful photograph of a campus taken in 1867 after the Civil War. And one of the amazing things about it is not just campus, but when you look on what's in front of campus, what 37th Street looked like at that point, there's shacks, and very rundown shacks at that, right outside the university gates.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank Dr. Glavin and Lynn Conway, and especially for the questions. We've never gone to questions so quickly, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your union.